My husband Derek and his friends thought it would be funny to leave me stranded in a small town in Italy after a fight. What they didn't know was that I owned a successful design consultancy they knew nothing about, had been secretly documenting his financial abuse for months, was already planning my exit strategy, and had connections in international business that would soon make their petty cruelty look like the biggest mistake of their lives. By the end of the story, Derek would be the one begging me to come back, but I was already building an empire he could never touch. And his attempts to destroy me would become the foundation of his spectacular downfall and the catalyst for a revenge so perfect it changed everything. Before we dive into how one act of cruelty became the catalyst for my complete transformation and Derek's spectacular fall from grace, I want to ask you something that might hit close to home. Have you ever had someone underestimate you so completely that they accidentally handed you the keys to your own freedom? Have you ever watched someone try to destroy you, only to realize they were actually setting you free to become everything they were too threatened to let you be? Drop a comment below and let me know, because this story is for everyone who's ever been told they're not capable of surviving on their own, everyone who's been made to feel small by someone who was supposed to love them, and everyone who's discovered that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever could have happened. And if stories of women who turn their lowest moments into their greatest victories resonate with you, if you believe in the power of transformation and the sweet satisfaction of justice served cold, consider subscribing. It's completely free, and it helps support more stories of resilience, triumph, and the kind of revenge that comes not from hatred, but from becoming so successful that your former oppressor becomes irrelevant. Now, let me tell you how being abandoned in a foreign country became the best thing that ever happened to me, and the beginning of the most satisfying, comprehensive, and absolutely perfect revenge I've ever witnessed, one that I didn't even have to plan. Because Derek and his friends destroyed themselves while I was busy building something extraordinary. But first, let me take you back to the beginning, because understanding how deep Derek's control went, how carefully I'd been planning my escape, and how completely he underestimated what he was dealing with makes what happened next so much more satisfying. The cracks in my marriage to Derek Williams had been showing for years, hairline fractures that I'd become expert at spackling over with forced smiles, careful excuses, and the kind of emotional labor that exhausts you so gradually you don't realize it's happening until you're running on empty. Derek, a respected architect with a carefully cultivated public image and a private personality that grew more controlling each year, had spent our 10-year marriage slowly eroding my independence while making it look like love, protection, and partnership to anyone watching from the outside. What Derek didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his wildest nightmares, was that for the past 2.5 years, I'd been systematically rebuilding myself in secret. Williams' sustainable design wasn't just a side hustle or a creative outlet, it was my meticulously planned escape route, a business that was already earning me more money than his architectural firm while he remained completely oblivious to its scope, success, and international recognition. I'd been documenting his financial control with the precision of a forensic accountant, recording his emotional manipulation with the thoroughness of a legal investigator, and cataloging his increasingly aggressive attempts to isolate me from my support network with the patience of someone building an airtight case. I had lawyers on retainer that he didn't know about, bank accounts in my maiden name that he'd never seen, business partnerships that existed completely outside his knowledge, and a 5-year plan that didn't include him anywhere in the equation. But I wasn't quite ready to make my move when fate, in the form of Derek's toxic college friends and their spectacular arrogance, forced my hand during what was supposed to be a romantic anniversary trip to Italy, a trip that I'd planned, paid for, and organized down to the last detail while Derek took credit for the thoughtful gesture. Let me paint you a picture of the kind of man Derek had become, because understanding his character is crucial to appreciating the complete destruction that followed. On the surface, Derek Williams was everything Seattle's social elite admired: successful, charming, well-connected, and married to a woman who made him look even better by comparison. He drove the right car, belonged to the right clubs, lived in the right neighborhood, and had mastered the art of making his controlling behavior look like caring leadership to anyone who wasn't living with it daily. But behind closed doors, Derek had spent years systematically dismantling my independence with the skill of someone who'd studied psychological manipulation. He managed our finances to simplify things, which really meant I had no access to accounts in my own name and had to ask permission for purchases over $50. He discouraged my friendships because they were negative influences or didn't understand our dynamic, which really meant he was threatened by anyone who might point out how abnormal our relationship had become. He gradually convinced me that my career ambitions were cute hobbies that might interfere with supporting his success, dismissing my design work as playing house and my business ideas as unrealistic fantasies. That showed I didn't understand how the real world worked. He even controlled what I wore to his business functions, going through my closet and removing items he considered inappropriate for an architect's wife or too attention-seeking for someone in your position. The truly insidious part was how he made it all seem reasonable, even caring. He was protecting me from financial stress by handling the money. He was looking out for my emotional well-being by steering me away from friends who didn't bring out my best qualities. He was helping me focus on what really mattered by discouraging career pursuits that would add unnecessary pressure to our lives. What Derek didn't know was that I'd been building Chin Williams' sustainable design in secret for over 2 years, using skills he didn't know I possessed and connections he couldn't have imagined I'd cultivated. The business started small, a single project for a coffee shop owner who wanted to minimize her environmental impact without sacrificing aesthetic appeal. But word spreads quickly in Seattle's sustainability community, especially when you're delivering results that exceed expectations while staying within budget and timeline. Within 6 months, I had 3 clients. Within a year, I was booked solid for 8 months out. By the time we left for Italy, Chin Williams had completed projects for major tech companies, luxury hotels, sustainable housing developments, and even a boutique resort chain that was planning international expansions. All under the name Natalie Chin Williams, all contracted through business accounts Derek had never seen, all paid into financial structures that existed completely outside his knowledge or control. But the real genius of my secret business wasn't just its success. It was how perfectly it had prepared me for independence in ways Derek would never suspect. Through Chin Williams, I'd developed relationships with lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, and business consultants who specialized in helping women establish independence from controlling relationships. I'd learned about international business law, tax structures for overseas work, and legal protections for business assets that couldn't be touched in divorce proceedings. I'd even started building an international network of contacts through the sustainable design community, architects, developers, resort owners, and government officials in countries where traditional building methods were being integrated with modern sustainability practices. Greece was particularly interesting to me because of their government incentives for ecotourism and their preservation efforts for traditional agricultural practices. So when we boarded that plane to Italy for what Derek thought was a romantic anniversary trip he'd planned, I was actually a successful international business owner with financial independence, legal protections, and escape routes he couldn't have imagined. I just wasn't quite ready to use them yet. The trip started exactly as I'd expected, Derek performing the role of loving husband while his college friends Jake Morrison and Ryan Phillips performed their usual roles as fraternity brothers who'd never mentally left their Stanford dorm rooms. Jake, a hedge fund manager whose personality had apparently peaked during Rush Week 20 years earlier, and Ryan, a tech company middle manager who'd never had an original thought but excelled at parroting whatever Jake said, treated every gathering like a reliving of their glory days with the desperation of men who'd realized their best years were behind them. What I didn't expect was how quickly the dynamic would escalate from uncomfortable to humiliating to absolutely life-changing. The argument that changed everything started over something so trivial I can barely remember the details now, but the context was everything. We were having lunch at a beautiful restaurant overlooking the Tuscan Hills, a restaurant I'd researched, called to make reservations, and navigated us to using the itinerary I'd spent weeks perfecting. Derek was drinking heavily with Jake and Ryan, despite it being only 1 p.m. and despite having a 2-hour drive ahead of us to reach our next destination. When I suggested, as gently as possible, that maybe he should slow down before we got back on the road, the reaction was immediate and disproportionate. Jake, already 3 wines deep and clearly feeling expansive, immediately jumped in with his usual commentary about how I was always trying to control Derek. "Dude, when did you become so whipped?" he slurred, signaling the waiter for another round despite my obvious discomfort. "She's got you on such a tight leash, it's embarrassing. My ex-wife used to pull this same controlling crap." Ryan nodded enthusiastically, because agreeing with Jake was apparently his primary function in life. "Seriously, man. You need to show her who's boss. This is supposed to be a guy's trip, and she's treating you like a child who can't make his own decisions." I felt the familiar knot forming in my stomach, but this time it was accompanied by something new, a cold, analytical clarity that I recognized from my most successful business negotiations. These men saw me as an obstacle to their fun, never mind that I was the one who'd planned this entire trip, made all the reservations, handled every detail, and was essentially managing their vacation for them while Derek played the charming, successful husband who generously brought his wife along on a boys' trip. What they didn't know was that I'd been recording these interactions on my phone, documenting the pattern of public humiliation and emotional abuse that had escalated over the past year. What they couldn't have imagined was that their wives, women I'd cultivated careful relationships with over years of dinner parties and charity events, had been confiding in me about their own marital problems, creating a network of information and mutual support that would prove invaluable in the months to come. But here's what makes this moment so perfectly ironic. While Jake and Ryan were lecturing Derek about standing up to his controlling wife, I was actually the one with the real power in our relationship. I had the successful business, the financial independence, the legal protections, and the escape plan. Derek's architectural firm was struggling to compete in Seattle's crowded market. His income had been declining for 2 years, and his professional reputation was increasingly dependent on the social connections I maintained and the dinner parties I organized. The three of them were living in a fantasy where men were naturally dominant and women were naturally dependent, never realizing that the woman they were dismissing as controlling and dramatic was actually subsidizing their entire lifestyle while planning her exit strategy. When Derek stumbled outside after me, abandoning our barely touched lunch to continue the argument on a narrow cobblestone street lined with tourist cafes, his words were slurred, but his anger was laser-focused. Years of resentment that I'd been carefully cataloging bubbled to the surface as curious Italian tourists pretended not to stare at the ugly Americans having a meltdown in public. "You're always embarrassing me in front of my friends," he hissed, swaying slightly as he pointed an accusatory finger at me. "Always acting like you're better than everyone else, like you're some kind of saint who doesn't know how to have fun. I asked you not to drive drunk, Derek. How is that embarrassing you? Because you make me look weak. Like I can't make my own decisions. Like I need permission from my wife to have a few drinks with my buddies." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 10 years of marriage, Derek had made every significant decision in our relationship. Where we lived, a house he'd chosen without consulting me, using a down payment that came largely from my savings. How we spent money, accounts I wasn't allowed to access independently, despite contributing more than half our income through my hobby business. Which friends we kept, somehow, all of mine had gradually been deemed problematic or excluded from our social circle. Even what I wore to his business functions, he'd actually gone through my closet and removed items he considered inappropriate for an architect's wife. But asking him not to endanger our lives apparently crossed some invisible line that threatened his masculinity in front of his equally toxic friends. "Your purse has your passport, right?" The question should have been my first warning, but I was too focused on the growing crowd of onlookers to process the malice behind his words. "Derek, you can't be serious. You'll figure it out. You're so smart, always telling me what to do." He pulled out the keys to our rental car, his friends emerging from the restaurant behind him with drunken grins that suggested they'd been planning this humiliation longer than I'd realized. "Maybe this will teach you to mind your own business for once." Jake actually had his phone out, recording my reaction as Derek climbed into the driver's seat. "This is gonna be hilarious," he laughed, his entitled smirk making me want to slap him. "Let's see how the control freak handles being out of control for once." Ryan was practically giggling as he climbed into the passenger seat. "She'll probably call her daddy to come rescue her," he said loud enough for me to hear. Bet she's never had to solve a problem without a man to fix it for her. The last thing I saw was the three of them driving away in our rental car, Jake still filming through the rear window while Derek and Ryan laughed at what they clearly considered the funniest prank they'd ever pulled. They left me standing alone on a cobblestone street in a town whose name I couldn't even pronounce, surrounded by sympathetic Italian strangers and the growing realization that my marriage had just imploded in the most publicly humiliating way possible. But here's what Derek and his friends didn't know, what no one knew except my lawyer, my accountant, and my business partners. I'd been preparing for this moment, or something like it, for months. Not this exact scenario, obviously, but the inevitable confrontation when Derek's need for control finally collided with my refusal to be controlled any longer. You see, I'd learned something crucial during my years of building Williams in secret. Real power doesn't come from controlling other people. Real power comes from being so secure in your own capabilities that no one else's opinion of you matters. Real power is having options they don't know about, resources they can't touch, and skills they don't recognize until it's too late. At first, I convinced myself it was just a scare tactic. Derek might be cruel when he drank, but he wouldn't actually abandon me in a foreign country. Would he? I stood there for nearly an hour, watching every car that rounded the corner, expecting to see their silver rental sedan returning with Derek wearing his sheepish, apologetic smile and some story about how the guys had convinced him to take it too far. But as the sun set and the Italian evening grew cool, reality began to sink in with the weight of absolute certainty. I pulled out my phone and called Derek's number. Straight to voicemail. Not just unavailable, but actively blocked. I tried Jake's number. The same result. Ryan's phone. Also blocked. Every single one of Derek's friends had coordinated this humiliation while I sat at that restaurant table, completely oblivious to their conspiracy. This wasn't a momentary impulse born from too much wine and wounded male pride. This was calculated. Premeditated. They had planned this degradation while I was ordering lunch, probably laughing about it in the bathroom while I sat there trying to salvage what I'd thought was supposed to be our anniversary celebration. But here's what they didn't realize. By blocking me, by cutting off all communication, by leaving me completely on my own, they'd just freed me from the last emotional chains that were keeping me in a relationship that was slowly killing who I really was. I counted the cash in my wallet with shaking hands. €80 and $37, enough for maybe one night in the cheapest accommodation I could find, but nowhere near sufficient for a flight home. My credit cards were in Derek's wallet. He'd offered to carry them earlier when my small Italian purse had gotten too crowded with souvenirs. At the time, it had seemed like husbandly consideration. Now I recognized it as another form of control, another way to ensure my dependence on his goodwill. But Derek had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed that because he'd isolated me from my old support network, because he'd convinced me my business was just a hobby, because he'd made me financially dependent on accounts he controlled, I would be helpless without him. What he didn't know was that Williams' sustainable design had its own business credit cards, its own banking relationships, and its own financial resources that he'd never seen or suspected. What he couldn't have imagined was that I had emergency contacts in 6 countries, business partners who would wire me money without questions, and legal protections that existed completely outside his knowledge. Have you ever had a moment where you suddenly saw your entire relationship with crystal clarity? Where all the small compromises and accommodations suddenly revealed themselves as something much darker? That's what happened to me standing on that Italian street, surrounded by the aroma of fresh pasta and the sound of families enjoying their evening meals. Comment below if you've ever had one of those devastating moments of realization, because what happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for Derek in ways he couldn't have imagined. I found a dingy pension above a bakery, run by an elderly woman whose weathered hands and kind eyes suggested she'd seen her share of stranded tourists over the years. She spoke no English, but seemed to understand desperation in any language, accepting my euros with a sympathetic pat on the arm and leading me up narrow stairs to a room barely larger than our walk-in closet back in Seattle. The accommodations were Spartan: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a sink that dripped constantly through the night, and a small window that looked out over the cobblestone street where my life had imploded just hours earlier. But it was shelter, and it gave me space to think without Derek's voice in my head telling me what I should be feeling, what I should be doing, how I should be reacting. That first night, lying in that narrow bed listening to the sounds of Italian life continuing normally outside my window, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made decisions based entirely on what I wanted. Not on what Derek would approve of or how it would affect his image or whether it fit into his vision of our life together. I called my business partner Jennifer Walsh, who was in Los Angeles overseeing the installation of a sustainable office complex we'd designed for a tech startup. When I explained my situation, carefully omitting the more humiliating details, her response was immediate and characteristic. "Nat, honey, are you telling me that jackass finally did something so stupid that you're ready to leave him?" "I think so," I admitted. "But I'm stuck in Italy with no access to our joint accounts and no way to get home without calling my parents and explaining everything." "Our joint accounts?" Jennifer's voice was sharp with the kind of business instinct that had made her one of Seattle's most successful architects before she'd shifted into sustainable design consulting. "Please tell me you haven't been running Chin Williams through joint accounts that Derek can access." "Of course not," I said, feeling slightly insulted that she'd even ask. "But all my personal banking is tied to accounts he manages." "Natalie, Chin Williams cleared $400,000 in profit last quarter. You have business credit cards, emergency funds, and financial resources that exist completely independent of whatever domestic arrangement you have with Derek. More importantly, you have business partners who care about your well-being and success." It was like a light switch flipping on. For so long, I'd been thinking of my business as something separate from my real life, something I did on the side while Derek handled the important financial decisions. But Jennifer was right. I wasn't just a wife who dabbled in design. I was a successful business owner with financial independence and professional obligations that transcended my marriage. "Wire me 5,000 euros, I said, surprised by the decisiveness in my own voice. "I'm going to extend this trip and figure out what I want to do next." "That's my girl," Jennifer said with audible satisfaction. "And Nat? Take your time. The business can handle things here, and, honestly, some space from Derek might give you perspective on just how much you've been carrying in that relationship." Over the next 2 days, while Derek and his friends continued their vacation as if nothing had happened, I began the process of untangling my life from the web of control and dependence that had seemed so normal until I was forced to function without it. 27 calls to Derek over 2 days. All sent straight to voicemail. Text messages delivered but never answered. I tried reaching out to mutual friends back in Seattle, but got only awkward deflections and suggestions that maybe I should just call Derek directly to work things out. No one wanted to get involved in what they assumed was a typical marital spat that would blow over once we both cooled down. Melissa Ross, my college roommate and one of the few friends Derek hadn't managed to completely alienate, was the only one who seemed genuinely concerned. "Nat, this doesn't sound like Derek," she said during our brief phone conversation. "Are you sure there isn't more to the story? Maybe he's planning some kind of surprise to make up for it." Even she couldn't quite believe that the charming, successful man she'd known for a decade was capable of this level of cruelty. Derek had always been so careful to maintain his public image, so skilled at making his control look like protection, his manipulation seemed like love. To everyone else, we were the perfect couple, the successful architect and his supportive wife who'd given up her own career to help him build his. But sitting in that cramped pension room, I realized something profound. For the first time in years, no one was monitoring my choices. No one was questioning my decisions or suggesting I was being too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive. Derek had meant to teach me a lesson about dependence, but instead he'd accidentally shown me what independence felt like. On the third morning, as I sat in a small cafe nursing a single espresso, something shifted inside me. The fear and humiliation were still there, but they were being rapidly replaced by something I hadn't felt in years: excitement about my own possibilities. I thought about the design consultancy I'd been building in secret. Sustainable interior design for eco-conscious businesses, a niche I discovered purely by accident when Derek had dismissed my interest in environmental issues as another one of your phases that'll pass once you get bored. I'd started taking on small projects just to prove him wrong, but word had spread quickly in Seattle's sustainability community. My client list now included 3 major tech companies, 2 boutique hotels, a sustainable housing development, and most recently, a luxury eco-resort chain that was planning Mediterranean expansions. All of them paying premium rates for designs that prioritized both aesthetics and environmental responsibility. All of them working with Natalie Williams, the business name I'd registered 18 months earlier when I'd finally admitted to myself that my marriage was slowly killing the person I used to be. Derek knew I did some freelance work, but he assumed it was minor supplemental income that helped pay for my shopping habits. Another way, he diminished my achievements while making me seem frivolous and dependent. He had no idea I'd been earning more than his architectural firm for the past 8 months. He definitely didn't know about the business account I'd opened under my maiden name, or the LLC I'd quietly established with the help of a lawyer Derek had never met. But sitting in that Italian cafe, I realized something even more significant. I didn't want to go back to Seattle and the life I'd been living there. Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. The pawn shop was tucked between a pharmacy and a gelato stand, its dusty window displaying an eclectic mix of jewelry, electronics, and musical instruments that told stories of other people's desperate moments. I stood outside for 20 minutes, twisting my wedding ring, the 2-carat diamond Derek had upgraded on our 5th anniversary, replacing the modest band we'd started with. He'd made a big show of the upgrade, presenting it at a dinner party in front of his business partners and their wives, making sure everyone knew how successful he'd become, how well he was taking care of his wife. "Only the best for my girl," he'd said, kissing my cheek while the women cooed appreciatively and the men nodded approvingly at this display of husbandly generosity. What they didn't see was how he'd used the ring as another form of control. "You know how much that cost," he'd remind me whenever I expressed interest in anything he considered extravagant: a weekend trip with friends, a professional development course, even dinner at a restaurant he hadn't pre-approved. The ring wasn't a symbol of love, it was a golden chain that reminded me daily of my obligation to be grateful for his provision. The shopkeeper, a tired-looking man with kind eyes, offered me far less than the ring's actual value, maybe a third of what Derek had paid. But it was enough to fund the next phase of my journey, enough to buy me time and space to figure out my next move. As he counted out euros, I felt the weight of 10 years of marriage lifting from my finger. "America? Call family," he suggested in broken English, probably the most common solution for stranded tourists who ended up in his shop. I nodded and smiled, but inside, a different plan was forming. Family meant explanations. Family meant hearing my mother's "I told you so" about Derek's controlling tendencies that I'd spent years defending. Family meant returning to Seattle, to our house, to the life where I'd gradually made myself smaller to accommodate Derek's expanding ego and need for dominance. Instead, I bought a bus ticket to Greece. Specifically, to the most remote coastal village the ticket agent could route me to, a place called Corinthos that required 3 different buses and a ferry to reach. If Derek ever bothered to look for me, he'd expect me to run home to family or friends. He'd never think to look for his helpless, dependent wife building a new life on a Greek olive farm. But here's what I didn't tell the ticket agent, what I didn't tell anyone: this wasn't a panicked flight from my problems. This was a strategic retreat to a place where I could rebuild myself without interference, where I could test my theories about my own capabilities, where I could discover what Natalie Williams was capable of when she wasn't constantly being told she was too much, too little, too emotional, too ambitious, too everything that made Derek uncomfortable. The journey took 14 hours and left me exhausted, hungry, and completely disoriented. But as I stumbled off the final bus in the tiny port village that would connect me to Corinthos, Breathing in the salt air and taking in the whitewashed buildings, climbing up hillsides covered in ancient olive groves, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Possibility. My phone battery had died somewhere between countries, my stomach was hollow with hunger, and I had maybe enough euros for 2 nights in whatever passed for budget accommodation in this remote corner of Greece. But for the first time since Derek had driven away, I wasn't afraid. I was curious about what came next, excited about the blank slate spread out before me like the endless blue of the Aegean Sea. What I didn't expect was to collapse from dehydration and exhaustion while exploring the olive groves outside Corinthos. What I definitely didn't expect was to be rescued by Sophia and Andreas Demetrio, an elderly couple who ran a small organic olive farm and who were about to change my life in ways I couldn't have imagined, and provide me with the foundation for a revenge so perfect it still makes me smile when I think about it. Sophia found me unconscious on a dirt path between ancient olive trees, the Greek sun having finally overwhelmed my city-soft constitution and the emotional exhaustion of the past 3 days. When I came to, I was looking up at the kindest face I'd ever seen, weathered by decades of Mediterranean sun, but with eyes that radiated warmth and genuine concern for a complete stranger. "Poso kala kore mau?" she asked, which I would later learn meant, "How are you, my daughter?" But in that moment, her tone conveyed everything I needed to know. Someone cared whether I lived or died. Someone was willing to help without knowing my story, without judging my circumstances, without expecting anything in return. Andreas appeared moments later, a tall, lean man with sun-darkened skin and silver hair, who moved with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own life. Together, they helped me to their small stone farmhouse nestled among the olive groves, Sophia chattering in rapid Greek while Andreas assessed my condition with the practical efficiency of someone who dealt with medical emergencies in remote locations. The kitchen welcomed me with the scent of herbs hanging from wooden beams and something savory bubbling on an ancient stove that looked like it belonged in a museum. Sophia settled me at a worn wooden table that bore the marks of decades of family meals, while Andreas appeared with cool water and a concerned expression that reminded me of my grandfather, who died when I was 12. Over the next few hours, through a combination of Sophia's limited English, Andreas's patient gestures, and a translation app on my phone once I found their charger, I attempted to explain my situation. I expected questions, judgment, maybe suggestions about contacting authorities or family. Instead, Sophia simply nodded as if women being abandoned by their husbands was a common Tuesday occurrence, and Andreas offered me their spare room with a casual wave that suggested the decision was already made. "You stay," Sophia said in carefully pronounced English, her first complete sentence to me. "Rest. Eat. We talk tomorrow." But before we go further into what happened during those transformative months in Corinthos, let me tell you what was happening back in Seattle while I was discovering my true capabilities. Because Derek's story during this time is almost as satisfying as mine. Derek, Jake, and Ryan returned from Italy with what they thought was the funniest story they'd ever lived through. They'd actually abandoned Derek's controlling wife in a foreign country. They'd taught her a lesson about respect and shown her what happened when women didn't know their place. Jake was so proud of the prank that he immediately started sharing it at business events and social gatherings around Seattle. Screenshot after screenshot showed up on his social media, photos from that day, videos he'd taken while they drove away, commentary about putting wives in their place and showing uppity women what real consequences look like. He tagged Derek in every post, clearly expecting his friend to share in the celebration of their clever prank. Ryan joined in enthusiastically, posting his own version of events that painted me as a controlling shrew who'd finally gotten what I deserved. He shared memes about nagging wives and controlling women, all with captions that referenced their hilarious adventure in Italy. Their wives, women I'd considered friends, women I'd hosted in my home and supported through their own marital difficulties, liked and shared these posts, turning my humiliation into entertainment for their social networks. But Derek's social media behavior revealed something even more disturbing. Rather than expressing concern about my welfare or attempting to locate me, He'd been telling people I was taking some time to think about my priorities and dealing with some emotional issues that require professional help. He'd positioned himself as the long-suffering husband whose unstable wife had abandoned their marriage over a trivial disagreement. The narrative he'd constructed was masterful in its manipulation. I was the problem, too sensitive, too controlling, too emotionally unstable to handle his success and the demands of being married to an important man. He was the victim, patient, understanding, waiting for his troubled wife to get the help she needed and return to the marriage she'd damaged with her irrational behavior. What Derek didn't realize was that his version of events didn't match the story Jake and Ryan were telling online. While Derek was playing the concerned husband whose wife was having a breakdown, his friends were celebrating their role in abandoning me as a hilarious prank. The inconsistency was obvious to anyone paying attention, and Seattle's social circles love nothing more than inconsistent stories from people who think they're above consequences. But here's where Derek made his biggest mistake. He assumed that because he'd isolated me from my old support network, because he'd convinced our mutual friends that I was emotionally unstable, because he'd crafted a narrative where I was the problem in our marriage, no one would question his version of events or care enough to look deeper into what had really happened. What he didn't account for was that I'd been building relationships and professional connections that existed completely outside his knowledge or influence. The clients, partners, and colleagues who knew me through Chin Williams had a very different perspective on my character, competence, and stability. When I didn't show up for scheduled meetings and calls, when my business partners couldn't reach me, when projects started falling behind because their lead designer had vanished, people started asking questions. Jennifer Walsh was the first to start digging. When I missed a client presentation for the third day in a row without explanation, she called our house in Seattle. Derek answered with his practiced explanation about my emotional breakdown and need for professional help, but Jennifer knew me well enough to recognize the red flags in his story. "That's interesting," she told Derek with the kind of calm professionalism that made her such an effective negotiator. "Because Natalie seemed perfectly stable when we spoke 3 days ago about the sustainability conference in Barcelona next month. In fact, she was excited about presenting our Mediterranean expansion plans to potential investors." Derek apparently stumbled through some explanation about how my breakdown had been sudden and unexpected, but Jennifer was already connecting dots that didn't form the picture Derek was trying to paint. Within 24 hours, Jennifer had contacted every client, partner, and professional connection associated with Chin Williams. The story that emerged was of a highly competent, successful business owner who'd built an international reputation for innovative design work and who'd been planning an expansion into Mediterranean markets that would position her as a leader in sustainable tourism development. This woman, the real Natalie Chin Williams, bore no resemblance to the unstable wife Derek was describing to their social circle. But the most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source: Rebecca Martinez, a financial advisor who specialized in helping women establish independence from controlling relationships. Rebecca had been working with me for 6 months to structure my business assets in ways that would protect them from marital claims and ensure my financial independence. When Rebecca couldn't reach me for our scheduled quarterly review, she made a few discreet inquiries and quickly discovered that Derek was telling people I was having a mental health crisis. But Rebecca had access to something Derek didn't know existed: detailed financial records that showed not only the true scope of my business success, but also documentation of his controlling behavior that I'd been gathering as part of our legal preparation. Rebecca understood immediately what had happened. A financially abusive husband had escalated to abandonment when his control was challenged, and he was now using mental health stigma to cover his tracks and maintain his public image. She also knew that I had resources and protections in place that Derek couldn't touch, which meant his strategy of isolating me financially had already failed. So while I was learning to harvest olives and discovering my own capabilities in Corinthos, Rebecca was quietly building a case that would soon expose Derek's true character to everyone who mattered in his professional and social circles. But let me take you back to my first night at the Demetrio farm, sleeping in a narrow bed under a handmade quilt that smelled of lavender and mountain air. I cried harder than I had since my father's funeral 5 years earlier, but these weren't tears of despair or self-pity. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that felt almost like rebirth. For the first time in years, I was in a place where I didn't have to perform or pretend or carefully manage someone else's emotions to keep the peace. I had expected to stay maybe 3 days, just long enough to figure out my next move and contact my business associates about extending my absence. That was 4 months ago, and what happened during those months became the foundation for the most satisfying revenge story I've ever lived through. Let me ask you something. Have you ever discovered a talent you didn't know you had? Something that felt so natural, so right, that you wondered how you'd lived without it? Because that's what happened when Sophia handed me my first olive harvesting rake and taught me the ancient art of coaxing fruit from thousand-year-old trees that had weathered invasions, wars, and centuries of changing hands while continuing to produce liquid gold. My soft, manicured hands that Derek had insisted on maintaining with weekly salon visits because an architect's wife should look the part, developed calluses within the first week. My pale Seattle skin, protected for years by expensive sunscreens and dermatologist appointments, turned golden brown from hours under the Mediterranean sun. My body, accustomed to designer gyms and carefully measured exercise routines designed to maintain the figure Derek preferred, adapted to the physical demands of farm work with surprising enthusiasm. Each morning brought new lessons that went far beyond agriculture. How to read the subtle signs that indicated optimal harvest timing, the way morning light caught the fruit, the feel of olives that were ready to release from their branches. How to grade olives by quality for different uses, premium fruit for the finest oil, slightly damaged ones for soap making, everything else for table olives. How to operate the traditional stone press that had been in Andreas's family for 3 generations, turning our harvest into liquid gold that sold for premium prices at markets across the region. But the real transformation wasn't physical. For the first time in my adult life, I was learning skills that Derek hadn't approved, pursuing interests he hadn't vetted, making decisions he couldn't override. Every day brought tangible proof of my competence and value, measured not in Derek's approval or his friends' acceptance, but in the quality of our olive oil and the respect of customers who returned week after week to our stall at the village market. Sophia and Andreas treated me like the daughter they'd lost to emigration years earlier. Their own daughter Maria had moved to Australia with her husband after finishing university, taking their only grandchild with her to build a new life in Sydney. In me, they found not just extra hands for their farm, but someone to carry on traditions they'd feared would die with them, someone to bridge the gap between their ancient knowledge and the modern world that was slowly encroaching on their simple way of life. "You learn fast," Andreas commented one evening as we processed the day's harvest, his broken English improving alongside my rudimentary Greek. Smart hands, smart mind. Coming from a man who spoke only when he had something important to say, it was the highest compliment I'd ever received, and it meant more to me than any praise Derek had ever offered, because it was earned through competence rather than compliance. But here's where the story gets really interesting, where my accidental landing in Corinthos started becoming Derek's worst nightmare, though he wouldn't discover that for months. The design consultancy I'd started in secret hadn't disappeared when Derek abandoned me in Italy. Thanks to video conferencing technology and cloud-based project management systems, I'd been able to continue serving my Seattle clients while developing entirely new expertise in sustainable agriculture and traditional building techniques that were revolutionizing eco-conscious design. Working with Sophia and Andreas taught me things no design school could have: how traditional building methods could be adapted for modern sustainability needs, how local materials could create luxury experiences that honored rather than exploited their environments, how ancient agricultural wisdom could inform contemporary landscape architecture in ways that were both beautiful and profitable. My client base began expanding internationally after I started incorporating these traditional Greek elements into my designs. The luxury eco-resort chain that had been planning Mediterranean expansions was particularly interested in my newfound expertise. 3 properties in different countries hired me to design spaces that honored local traditions while meeting modern sustainability standards and 5-star luxury expectations. But here's what really started to set the foundation for Derek's downfall. Word began spreading in international design circles about the American architect who'd combined traditional Greek agricultural methods with cutting-edge sustainable design to create something entirely new. Articles started appearing in design magazines. Industry blogs featured my work. Sustainable tourism organizations began reaching out about consulting opportunities. And all of this recognition was coming to Natalie Chen-Williams, a name that Derek had never taken seriously, for work he'd never seen, in a field he'd always dismissed as a hobby that would eventually pass once I got bored. Within 2 months of arriving in Corinthos, my revenue had tripled. My waiting list had extended to 8 months. Design magazines were starting to notice the unique aesthetic I was developing, what one journalist called authentically rooted luxury that makes sustainability feel indulgent rather than sacrificial. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Derek's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel in ways he couldn't control or even fully understand. Jennifer Walsh had been making discreet inquiries about my absence, and the inconsistencies in Derek's story were becoming impossible to ignore. The mentally unstable wife who'd abandoned her marriage over a trivial disagreement didn't match the highly successful business owner who'd been planning international expansions and conference presentations just days before her disappearance. Rebecca Martinez had taken things a step further, using her professional network to investigate whether Derek's behavior constituted financial abuse, a federal crime when it involved businesses with interstate or international operations. What she discovered was a pattern of control and manipulation that met several legal definitions of domestic abuse, including economic coercion and isolation tactics. But the real catalyst for Derek's eventual destruction came from an unexpected source: Dr. Patricia Williams, Derek's own mother, who'd never particularly liked me but had always respected what she considered my stabilizing influence on her son. Dr. Williams, a retired psychology professor with a specialty in narcissistic personality disorders, had been growing increasingly concerned about Derek's behavior over the past year. She'd noticed his increasing need to control every aspect of our marriage, his dismissive attitude toward my accomplishments, and his growing tendency to isolate me from friends and family. When Derek called to inform her that I'd had a mental breakdown and abandoned our marriage, Dr. Williams's professional training kicked in. The story didn't fit the psychological profile of someone having a genuine mental health crisis. Instead, it sounded exactly like what she'd expect to hear from someone trying to cover up their own abusive behavior. Dr. Williams started making her own discreet inquiries, contacting mutual friends and family members to get a clearer picture of what had really happened. What she discovered horrified her. Derek had not only abandoned me in a foreign country, but his friends had filmed the incident and were sharing it online as entertainment. The screenshots Jake had posted showed Derek driving away while I stood alone on an Italian street, clearly distressed and abandoned. The captions celebrated teaching wives a lesson and showing women their place. These weren't the actions of a concerned husband dealing with his wife's mental health crisis. They were the actions of a cruel man who'd orchestrated a deliberate humiliation. Dr. Williams, being a psychology professor with decades of experience in family dynamics, understood immediately that Derek had been projecting his own psychological issues onto me. The controlling behavior, the need to isolate me from support systems, the financial manipulation, the public humiliation, these were classic signs of someone with serious personality disorders, not someone married to a person with mental health problems. 3 months in, Sophia sat me down at their kitchen table with an envelope bearing my name. Inside were partnership papers, written in both Greek and English by Theodora Papadakis, the village's only lawyer and a woman whose sharp legal mind was hidden behind a grandmother's warm demeanor. "We are old," Sophia explained in her carefully practiced English, her weathered hands folding mine around the documents. "Andreas is 72, I am 68. Maria will not return from Australia. Her life is there now, with her husband's family. The trees are 200 years old. They need young hands, young ideas, someone who understands both the old ways and the new world." I stared at the documents, understanding their significance went far beyond business. This wasn't charity or temporary employment. This was legitimate partnership, earned recognition, a foundation for building the kind of life I'd never dared imagine possible. A life where my contributions were valued, where my intelligence was appreciated, where my growth was encouraged rather than controlled. But here's what made this partnership truly powerful. It wasn't just about olive farming. Sophia and Andreas owned 30 acres of prime Mediterranean coastline, including mineral rights and development potential that had been in their family for generations. They'd resisted all offers from developers because they wanted to preserve their land's agricultural heritage, but they'd been waiting for the right person to help them find a way to honor both tradition and progress. With my design background and their agricultural expertise, we began developing plans for a sustainable agritourism venture that would showcase traditional farming methods while providing luxury accommodations for visitors interested in authentic cultural experiences. The business plan I developed projected revenues that would dwarf anything Derek's architectural firm had ever achieved. And still, Derek had no idea any of this was happening. My transformation wasn't just professional. The community in Corinthos welcomed me with a warmth I'd never experienced in Seattle's competitive social circles. Dimitri, who owned the village taverna, started featuring our olive oil on every table with small cards explaining our traditional production methods. Yanis, the pharmacist, included me in his weekly coffee gatherings where local business owners discussed everything from village politics to the best techniques for preserving traditional foods. Dina, a weaver whose stall stood beside ours at the weekly market, became a particular friend. 40-something and widowed young, she possessed a sharp wit and pragmatic outlook that reminded me of my college roommate. Our conversations, conducted in my improving Greek and her excellent English, ranged from business strategies to village gossip to deeper reflections about what it meant to rebuild your life after loss. "You never speak of America," she observed one quiet afternoon as we packed up our unsold goods. "Family there? Friends?" The question pierced me unexpectedly. I'd grown so focused on building my new life that I'd pushed thoughts of my old one aside. "A few friends," I admitted. "But my husband, he didn't encourage those relationships." Dina nodded knowingly. "The husband who left you in Italy. You never say his name." "Derek," I said, the syllables feeling foreign on my tongue after months of silence. "His name is Derek, and he never searched for me." "And he never searched for you?" Her directness was refreshing after months of Sophia and Andreas's gentle avoidance of the topic. "I don't know," I admitted. "I haven't checked my phone for American messages." I wasn't ready to deal with whatever might be waiting there. Dina's raised eyebrow challenged me. "Perhaps time to look. Not for him, for you. To close the door properly, or to understand if it was ever really open." Her words stayed with me for days. That evening, after helping Sophia prepare dinner and updating our business projections for the agritourism venture, I retreated to my room and powered up my old phone, connecting to the farmhouse's basic Wi-Fi with trembling fingers. What I found changed everything, not just my understanding of what had happened in Italy, but my plans for what would happen next. Hundreds of unread messages filled the screen. Scanning the senders, I spotted several from old friends, their subject lines evolving from casual check-ins to concerned inquiries to increasingly frantic worry. A surge of shame washed over me as I realized I'd disappeared from their lives without explanation, just as thoroughly as I'd vanished from Derek's. But mixed in with the concerned messages from friends were others that made my blood run cold. Jake Morrison had apparently decided that abandoning me in Italy was such a hilarious story that he'd been dining out on it at business events and social gatherings around Seattle. Screenshots of his social media posts showed him treating my abandonment as a punchline, complete with photos from that day and commentary about putting wives in their place. Ryan Phillips had joined in, posting his own version of events that painted me as a controlling shrew who'd finally gotten what I deserved. Their wives, women I'd considered friends, women I'd hosted in my home and supported through their own marital difficulties, had liked and shared these posts, turning my humiliation into entertainment for their social networks. But it was Derek's digital behavior that truly revealed the depth of his cruelty. Rather than searching for me or expressing concern about my welfare, He'd been telling people I was taking some time to think about my priorities and dealing with some emotional issues that require professional help. He'd positioned himself as the long-suffering husband whose unstable wife had abandoned their marriage over a trivial disagreement. The narrative he'd constructed was masterful in its manipulation. I was the problem. Too sensitive, too controlling, too emotionally unstable to handle his success and the demands of being married to an important man. He was the victim, patient, understanding, waiting for his troubled wife to get the help she needed and return to the marriage she'd damaged with her irrational behavior. But then I found something that changed everything, a thread from my former design mentor, Jennifer Walsh, who'd been trying to reach me for weeks. She'd recommended me for a remote consulting position with a major sustainable building materials company. The opportunity had expanded into something much larger, a chance to develop their entire Mediterranean market strategy, with compensation that would make Derek's annual income look like pocket change. The final email in the thread, dated just hours earlier, indicated the position was still open if I was interested. They'd been so impressed with my portfolio and Jennifer's recommendation that they were willing to wait for my response, even extending their timeline because they believed I was exactly what they needed for this expansion. As I scrolled through Jennifer's messages, I realized she'd been following my work more closely than I'd known. She'd seen the magazine features about my evolving design aesthetic, the client testimonials about my unique approach to sustainable luxury, the growing recognition in international design circles. She knew I was building something significant, even if I hadn't fully recognized it myself. But what really caught my attention were the messages from Rebecca Martinez, my financial advisor. She'd been trying to reach me about urgent developments in Seattle, developments that would soon make Derek regret every decision he'd made since driving away from that Italian cafe. Rebecca's messages revealed that Derek's story was falling apart under scrutiny. Jennifer Walsh had been making inquiries about my disappearance that revealed inconsistencies in Derek's narrative. Business associates who knew me through Chin Williams were questioning the mental health crisis story, especially since I'd been scheduled for high-profile presentations and client meetings that Derek had known nothing about. More importantly, Rebecca had been in contact with Dr. Patricia Williams, Derek's own mother, who was growing increasingly suspicious of her son's behavior and story. Dr. Williams had started conducting her own investigation into what had really happened in Italy, and what she discovered was damaging Derek's reputation in ways he was only beginning to understand. But it was another email sender that froze my fingers on the screen, Derek Williams, with the subject line, "I know where you are." The timestamp showed it had arrived just hours earlier, meaning he'd finally tracked me down after months of maintaining his fiction about my voluntary absence. Heart-pounding, I clicked it open. "Natalie, it's taken months and a private investigator, but I finally tracked you to that backwater village in Greece. This has gone on long enough. I'm coming to bring you home and end this ridiculous tantrum. My flight lands in Athens on Thursday. Be ready. We have a lot to discuss about your behavior and the embarrassment you've caused both of us. The business community is starting to ask uncomfortable questions, and I need you back in Seattle to help repair the damage your disappearance has caused to both our reputations. This little adventure of yours ends now. Derek." 3 days from now. The room spun around me as panic and fury collided in my chest. How dare he? After abandoning me, after months without a word, after allowing his friends to publicly humiliate me while he played the victim, he expected to simply collect me like misplaced luggage? But as the initial shock faded, something else took its place. A cold, calculating calm that I recognized from my most successful business negotiations. Derek was coming here expecting to find the broken, dependent woman he'd abandoned in Italy. Instead, he would find a successful business owner, a partner in a thriving agricultural operation, and a woman who had discovered she was capable of far more than he had ever allowed her to believe. More importantly, he would find someone who now had the resources, connections, and legal protections to ensure that his cruelty would have consequences he couldn't escape or manipulate. I stumbled downstairs, the phone clutched in my hand, finding Sophia at the kitchen table reviewing our market day receipts. She looked up from the ledger, her smile fading as she registered my expression. Bad news from America, she asked gently. Derek, I managed. He's coming here. Thursday. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw a flash of the steel that had helped her survive 70 years of life in a traditional Greek village. She reached beneath the ledger and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table toward me. Good timing then, she said. Was waiting for right moment. Inside, I found legal papers bearing my name alongside Sophia and Andreas's, written in Greek with English translations. But these weren't just the partnership agreement we'd signed weeks earlier. These were comprehensive business documents that established me as a full partner in everything: the farm, the olive oil business, the property development rights, and the agritourism venture we'd been planning. Partnership agreement, Sophia explained, but her tone suggested there was more. 1/3 business, yes. But also protection. Greek law very strong for partners. Very difficult for outsiders to make problems for people with legal standing and community. I understood then. Sophia and Andreas weren't just offering me a business partnership, they were offering me legal protection and community support that Derek couldn't touch or manipulate. They were giving me the foundation to stand against whatever pressure he might try to apply. You choose what happens Thursday, Sophia said firmly, tapping the papers. You have home here, business here, friends here. She pointed to the phone in my hand. That man, he no longer decides anything for you. The truth of her words settled over me like armor. Derek was coming, but he would find a very different woman than the one he'd left behind. More than that, he would find a woman who had built something he could never touch, never control, never diminish, and he was about to discover that his attempts to break me had accidentally created his worst nightmare. But before Thursday arrived, I had work to do. Not the frantic preparation of someone afraid of confrontation, but the methodical preparation of someone who understood that this meeting would determine not just my future, but Derek's as well. The following days passed in a blur of strategic preparation. I visited Theodora, the village lawyer, who helped me draft comprehensive divorce papers in both Greek and English. I contacted Jennifer Walsh, accepting not just the consulting position, but also proposing an expanded partnership that would make Chin Williams an international firm with offices in 3 countries. I wrote careful emails to the friends I'd left behind, offering brief explanations without apologies and extending invitations to visit my new life in Greece. I contacted clients and business partners, updating them on my expanded capabilities and the new services we could offer based on my Mediterranean experience. But most importantly, I spent time with Sophia and Andreas, learning more about the legal protections my partnership provided and the community support I could count on. In traditional Greek villages, business partnerships are taken seriously and partners are considered family. By accepting their offer, I hadn't just joined a business. I'd been adopted into a network of relationships that would protect and support me in ways Derek could never understand or penetrate. I also made a call to Rebecca Martinez, updating her on my situation and asking her to prepare for the next phase of what we'd been planning for months. Derek's abandonment had actually simplified the legal aspects of our divorce, providing clear evidence of abandonment and emotional abuse that would strengthen my position in any proceedings. Natalie, Rebecca said with satisfaction in her voice, Derek has no idea what he's walking into. The business assets you've built, the legal protections you have in place, the documentation we've gathered about his controlling behavior. He's about to discover that abandoning you is the stupidest thing he could have done. What about his claims that I had a mental breakdown? Won't that complicate things? Actually, it makes things easier for us. He's been telling people for months that you're mentally unstable and unable to make rational decisions. Meanwhile, you've been building an internationally successful business, forming legal partnerships and making strategic decisions that demonstrate exceptional competence and mental clarity. His story doesn't match the evidence. Rebecca paused, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice when she continued. Plus, we have those social media posts from his friends celebrating your abandonment. It's going to be very difficult for Derek to claim he was concerned about your mental health when his buddies were posting videos of them driving away while you stood stranded on an Italian street. Thursday arrived with the kind of perfect Greek summer sky that makes tourists fall in love with the Mediterranean, cloudless and bright, with a breeze carrying the scent of wild herbs and olive blossoms. I was in the processing shed, testing oil samples with Andreas and discussing our expansion plans for next season, when the unfamiliar sound of a rental car engine broke the afternoon quiet. Sophia appeared at the doorway, her expression a mixture of concern and resolve. "He is here," she said simply. Heart hammering, I wiped my hands on my work apron and stepped outside. Derek stood beside a sleek silver sedan, designer sunglasses perched on his perfectly styled hair, examining our humble farmhouse with obvious distaste. He wore the casual but expensive travel outfit I recognized from countless business trips, tailored chinos and a button-down that probably cost more than a week's profit from our olive oil sales. For a moment, looking at him felt like seeing a character from a movie I'd watched long ago. This man who had once been the center of my universe now seemed somehow smaller, less substantial, against the backdrop of ancient olive trees and weathered stone buildings that had become my world. His designer clothes and practiced sophistication looked almost comical in this setting, like watching someone play dress-up in a costume that no longer fit. "Derek," I called, my voice steadier than I'd expected. He turned, and the shock that registered on his face was almost comical. His eyes traveled from my work boots to my sun-browned arms, lingering on my hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, my face free of the careful makeup that had been part of my daily armor in Seattle. I watched recognition battle with disbelief across his features as he tried to reconcile this confident, capable woman with the helpless wife he'd abandoned 4 months earlier. "My God, Natalie, what happened to you?" The familiar disapproving tone that once would have sent me scrambling to fix whatever he found lacking now simply washed over me like water off stone. "Life happened," I replied, taking measured steps toward him. "What are you doing here, Derek?" He removed his sunglasses, his practiced charm sliding into place as he extended his arms toward me in a gesture that once would have made me feel guilty for being upset with him. "I've come to take you home, of course. This has gone on long enough, don't you think?" Behind me, I heard the quiet shuffling of Sophia and Andreas emerging from the house. Though they couldn't understand our words, they positioned themselves where they could see and hear everything, silent guardians ready to intervene if needed. Their presence reminded me that I wasn't alone anymore, that I had people who valued me enough to stand with me against whatever manipulation Derek might attempt. "This isn't about making a point," I interrupted, stopping well outside his reach. "This is about making a life." His smile faltered, and I saw the first crack in his confident facade. "A life? Natalie, be serious. You're living in some farmer's spare room, doing manual labor for pocket change. This is what, some kind of eat, pray, love fantasy? I get it. You were upset about Italy, and you wanted to make a statement. Fine. Point made. Now let's go home and discuss this like adults." Derek noticed Sophia and Andreas then, his expression hardening as he took in their protective stance and obvious disapproval of his attitude. "Are these the people you've been staying with? Have they been holding you here? Because if so, there could be serious legal." "They've been teaching me," I cut in, my voice sharp enough to silence his threats. "About olive farming, about community, about kindness without conditions." I gestured toward the grove surrounding us. "I'm a partner now. I have a business here." Disbelief crossed his face, followed quickly by the condescension I knew so well. "A business? Natalie, be serious. You're a designer, not a farmer. You don't know anything about running a business, especially not in a foreign country where you can't even speak the language properly." "I speak enough Greek to handle our international clients," I replied calmly. "And enough Italian to negotiate with our suppliers in Tuscany. And enough Spanish to coordinate with our expansion into the Balearic Islands." The confusion on his face was almost satisfying enough to end the conversation there, but I was just getting started. "You see, Derek, while you've been telling everyone back home that I'm having some kind of emotional breakdown, I've been building something you could never understand. Something that doesn't require your approval or your management or your permission to exist." "What are you talking about?" His voice had lost its patronizing tone, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "I'm talking about Chin Williams' sustainable design expanding into 3 new countries. I'm talking about partnerships with luxury resort chains that value authenticity over pretension. I'm talking about agricultural ventures that blend traditional methods with modern sustainability practices. I pulled out my phone and opened my business banking app, turning the screen toward him. I'm talking about this. Derek's eyes widened as he processed the balance displayed, $847,000. That's impossible, he stammered. You don't have that kind of money. Your little design hobby brings in maybe $10,000 a year. My little design hobby, I said, savoring each word, has been earning more than your architectural firm for the past 8 months. Chen Williams Sustainable Design is a registered international LLC with clients in 6 countries and a waiting list that extends through next year. The color drained from his face as the implications began to sink in. But that's not possible. I handle our finances. I would have known if you were making that kind of money. You handle the finances for Derek and Natalie Williams. You've never had access to anything belonging to Natalie Chen Williams. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Did you really think I was so stupid that I'd build a business empire using accounts you could monitor and control? Business empire? He looked around at the modest farm with obvious confusion. Natalie, this is a few acres of olive trees and a stone house that probably doesn't even have reliable internet. Sophia stepped forward then, saying something in rapid Greek to Andreas, who nodded and disappeared into the house. She turned to Derek with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You want to see business? She asked in her careful English. Andreas brings papers. When Andreas returned, he carried a leather portfolio that he handed to Sophia with ceremonial gravity. She opened it and began pulling out documents, spreading them across the hood of Derek's rental car like a lawyer presenting evidence. Demetrio Family Holdings, she announced, pointing to the first set of papers. 30 acres, waterfront property, mineral rights, development permits approved by regional government. She moved to the next document. Organic certification, European Union export licenses, trademark registration for Demetrio premium oils in 12 countries. Derek stared at the papers, his expression growing more confused with each revelation. Partnership agreement, Sophia continued, pointing to another document. Natalie Chen Williams, equal partner. Legal standing in Greece, business visa permanent, right to buy property, right to expand operations. But it was the final document that made Derek's face go completely white. Andreas had returned with architectural plans, detailed, professional drawings showing the agritourism development we'd been planning. Resort accommodations, spa facilities, conference centers, all designed to blend seamlessly with the traditional farm while providing luxury amenities for international visitors. Phase 1 construction begins next month, Sophia explained with obvious pride. International investors very interested in authentic Greek experience designed by award-winning American architect who understands both luxury and tradition. Award-winning, Derek echoed weakly. 3 international design awards in past 4 months, I confirmed. Sustainable Luxury Design of the Year, Mediterranean Cultural Preservation Award, and Innovation in Ecotourism Architecture. All for projects I completed while living here, all featuring the integration of traditional methods with contemporary sustainability practices. I watched Derek process this information, saw the exact moment he realized that everything he'd believed about our relationship, about my capabilities, about his own importance in my life, had been completely wrong. This is ridiculous, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Whatever game you're playing, whatever point you're trying to make, you've made it. Now, let's discuss this rationally. We can work out some kind of arrangement where you keep your little projects here while we rebuild our marriage. Our marriage? I echoed. Derek, we don't have a marriage. We haven't had a marriage for years. We had an arrangement where I provided unpaid labor, social coordination, and emotional management in exchange for the privilege of being associated with your success. That's not fair, Natalie. I supported you. I gave you a beautiful home, financial security. You gave me a prison, I interrupted. A beautiful, expensive prison where every decision had to be approved by you, every friendship had to meet your standards, every dream had to fit into your vision of what an architect's wife should want. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the envelope Theodora had prepared, holding it toward Derek like a sword. These are divorce papers, already filed with provisions for division of assets. You'll find the terms quite generous, considering I'm only asking for what was mine before we married. He stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. But I wasn't done. There's something else you should know. I pulled out my phone again and opened a different app, one that showed my business's current projects and client list. Remember my little freelance design hobby? The one you said was a cute way for me to stay busy. Derek's eyes widened as he scrolled through the list of clients. Microsoft's new sustainable campus, the Ritz-Carlton's eco-resort chain, Tesla's solar installation facilities, 3 major film studios' green production facilities. These contracts alone are worth over $2 million, I continued. And that's just what's currently in the pipeline. Chen Williams has become the go-to firm for luxury sustainable design on the West Coast, and we're expanding internationally faster than I can hire qualified staff. The phone slipped from Derek's hands as the full scope of my success hit him. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of business experience. You never went to business school. You don't have an MBA. I have something better, I said, picking up my phone and dusting it off. I have talent, vision, and the freedom to pursue both without someone constantly telling me I'm not capable of success. Derek's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, wounded pride mixed with something that looked like genuine fear. You'll regret this, he said, but the threat sounded hollow even to him. When the novelty wears off and you're still hauling olives in the hot sun at 60, you'll remember what you gave up. Maybe I conceded. But I'd rather risk regret from choices I made than live with the certainty of regret from choices made for me. That's when Andreas stepped forward, placing a weathered hand on my shoulder. Though he couldn't understand our conversation, he recognized the conclusion in our body language. He said something in Greek to Derek, his tone firm but not unkind. What did he say? Derek asked, his voice smaller now. He said the road back to Athens is dangerous after dark. You should leave now to reach the city safely. Derek looked between the three of us, finally registering that this wasn't a negotiation or a rescue mission, but a goodbye. This isn't over, Natalie. You're still my wife. I have rights. No, I said quietly. You have papers to sign and a new reality to accept. Your rights ended when you abandoned me in Italy and spent 4 months telling everyone I was mentally unstable while I was building the life you never thought I was capable of creating. He opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to realize the futility of it. Without another word, he returned to his rental car, the divorce papers clutched in his hand like a death sentence. As the silver sedan disappeared down our dirt road, Sophia slipped her hand into mine. Good, she said simply. Now we make dinner. Tomorrow we plan the resort opening. Next week we meet with investors from Germany who want to franchise our model in Croatia. Together, the three of us turned toward the house, my house now too. The evening's work awaited, oil samples to catalog, dinner to prepare, international conference calls with clients who valued my expertise and vision. But Derek's visit wasn't the end of my transformation story, it was just the beginning of his spectacular downfall. Because what happened next proved that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice so perfect it feels like divine intervention. Have you ever watched someone's attempt to destroy you backfire so completely that it destroys them instead? Because that's exactly what happened to Derek over the next year, and I barely had to lift a finger to make it happen. 3 days after Derek returned to Seattle, I did something that still makes me smile when I think about it. I started making phone calls to every single one of our mutual friends, business associates, and social connections. Not to gossip or complain, but to share the truth about what had happened in Italy and what I'd built in the months since. Remember, these weren't just social acquaintances. These were Derek's clients, his business partners, his professional network, the same people whose opinions he'd been so worried about when my absence started looking bad for his image. The same people he'd been lying to for months about my mental state and voluntary absence. Jessica Morrison, Jake's wife, was my first call. I'd always suspected she was unhappy in her marriage, trapped by financial dependence and social expectations, just as I had been. When I told her about Jake's role in my abandonment and his social media posts celebrating it, her reaction was swift and decisive. I'm filing for divorce, she said after a long silence. I've been thinking about it for months, but this shows me exactly who he really is. And Natalie? I'm going to need a lawyer who specializes in high-asset divorces and financial abuse. Do you have any recommendations? I did, as it turned out. Theodora had connected me with several American lawyers who specialized in international divorce cases and financial crimes. Jessica's divorce proceedings revealed that Jake had been hiding assets and manipulating their financial accounts for years, information that proved very interesting to both his employer and the IRS. Ryan Phillips's wife had a similar reaction, especially when I showed her the screenshots of Ryan's social media posts mocking my abandonment. He always said you were controlling and dramatic, she admitted. But seeing him celebrate what happened to you, I realized he was describing you the way he actually treats me. Linda Phillips had been documenting her own experiences with Ryan's controlling behavior for months, unsure whether what she was experiencing constituted abuse. Seeing the gleeful cruelty he displayed toward me gave her the clarity she needed to recognize that his treatment of her wasn't normal or acceptable. He makes me account for every dollar I spend, she told me during our 3-hour phone conversation. He monitors my phone, questions where I've been, and has convinced me that I'm too emotional and irrational to handle important decisions. But watching him celebrate abandoning you made me realize that he enjoys making women feel powerless. The domino effect was swift and brutal. Within 2 weeks, Derek's architectural firm had lost 3 major contracts. 2 business partnerships dissolved when partners realized Derek's character issues might affect their professional reputations. The country club, where he'd been trying to gain membership for years, suddenly found his application inconsistent with club values. But the real satisfaction came when I learned what had happened to Jake and Ryan. Jake's employer, a prestigious hedge fund that prided itself on ethical business practices, launched an internal investigation after screenshots of his social media posts went viral among their female employees. The investigation revealed not just his public celebration of abandoning a woman in a foreign country, but a pattern of behavior toward female colleagues that violated multiple company policies. The hedge fund's HR department discovered that Jake had been creating a hostile work environment for years, making inappropriate comments about female colleagues' appearances, questioning their competence based on their gender, and celebrating instances where women in the office were put in their place by male supervisors. The Italy incident was just the most public example of behavior that had been ongoing but previously unreported. Female employees came forward with stories about Jake's comments during meetings, his tendency to interrupt women presenters, his habit of questioning female colleagues' data while accepting identical information from male coworkers without scrutiny. One junior analyst reported that Jake had told her she was too pretty to understand complex financial instruments and suggested she focus on client relations instead of research. Jake was terminated within 3 weeks of my phone calls, and the hedge fund made a public statement about their commitment to creating safe, respectful workplaces for all employees. His firing made the business news, complete with details about the social media posts that had triggered the investigation. Ryan lost his position at a tech company that had recently implemented strict social media policies for employees after several high-profile scandals. His posts about putting wives in their place were deemed incompatible with their stated commitment to diversity and inclusion. But more damaging were the comments from female coworkers who came forward after seeing the Italy posts, describing years of subtle harassment and discrimination that Ryan had disguised as workplace humor. The tech company's investigation revealed that Ryan had been creating documentation that questioned female colleagues' technical abilities, had consistently interrupted women in meetings, and had made comments about how certain projects were too complex for the ladies to handle. His termination was swift and public, serving as a warning to other employees about the consequences of discriminatory behavior. But Derek's professional humiliation was just the beginning. Because while he was dealing with the collapse of his reputation in Seattle, I was building something that would make his losses look insignificant compared to what he'd given up. The Sustainable Resort Project in Corinthos became a flagship case study for authentic ecotourism. Architectural Digest featured it as one of the year's most innovative hospitality designs, praising the seamless integration of traditional methods with luxury amenities. The European Union selected it as a model project for sustainable development in rural communities, providing funding for expansion and replication across the Mediterranean. The article in Architectural Digest was particularly satisfying because it included quotes from me about the importance of respecting local traditions while creating modern luxury experiences. The journalist had asked about my background, and I'd mentioned that I'd learned these principles while recovering from a difficult period in my personal life. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us force us to discover capabilities we never knew we had, I was quoted as saying. Being stripped of everything I thought defined me allowed me to build something much more authentic and meaningful. Derek's name appeared nowhere in the article, but anyone in Seattle's architectural community would recognize the project's location and timeline. The implicit message was clear. While Derek was dealing with professional scandals, his ex-wife was being celebrated in international design magazines for innovative work that exceeded anything he'd ever achieved. The magazine feature led to invitations for speaking engagements at major design conferences. I found myself presenting at events in Barcelona, Milan, and Dubai, sharing the stage with architects and designers whose work I'd admired for years. Each presentation expanded my professional network and brought new opportunities for Chinwilliams. The sustainability community embraced my story of combining traditional agricultural wisdom with contemporary design principles. Universities began reaching out about guest lectures and research collaborations. Government agencies interested in promoting ecotourism started consulting with us about policy development. Within 6 months of Derek's visit, I'd expanded Chinwilliams' sustainable design into a full-service firm with offices in Seattle, Los Angeles, and Athens. My team included 12 designers, 3 agricultural consultants, 2 cultural anthropologists, and a partnership network spanning 6 countries. The business that Derek had dismissed as a hobby was now generating annual revenues that dwarfed his architectural firm's best year. But perhaps the sweetest vindication came from an unexpected source: Derek's own mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, a woman I'd always respected despite her son's flaws. She called me 8 months after our confrontation in Greece, her voice warm with the kind of approval Derek had never offered. "Natalie, dear, I've been following your work in the design magazines," she said. "I wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've accomplished. I always knew Derek was holding you back, but I never imagined you'd flourish so spectacularly once you were free to be yourself." "Thank you, Patricia. That means more to me than you know." I also wanted to apologize for my son's behavior. What he did in Italy was unforgivable, and what he's been saying about you since then is even worse. You deserved so much better than the way he treated you. Dr. Williams paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. I've been in contact with some of Derek's former clients and business partners. They've been asking about his character, his reliability, his fitness for major projects. I've been honest about what I observed during your marriage: the controlling behavior, the attempts to diminish your accomplishments, the way he tried to isolate you from friends and family. "Patricia, you don't need to." "Oh, but I do," she interrupted firmly. "Derek has been telling people that you had a mental breakdown, that you abandoned your marriage over trivial issues, that you're emotionally unstable and unreliable. Meanwhile, you've been building an international business empire and earning recognition for innovative design work. The contrast between his claims and your achievements makes him look either delusional or deliberately dishonest." She was right. Derek's story about my mental instability became less credible with each article about my business success, each award I received, each major contract Chinwilliams secured. His narrative required people to believe that a mentally unstable woman had somehow built a multi-million-dollar international design firm while living in a Greek village and learning traditional agricultural techniques. "I heard about the divorce settlement," Dr. Williams continued. "He's furious that you're only taking what you brought into the marriage. He was counting on half of everything you've built since then." That was perhaps the most satisfying detail of all. Derek had assumed my business success belonged partly to him, as if being married to him had somehow contributed to my achievements. The divorce papers made it clear that Chinwilliams' sustainable design, along with all its assets and future earnings, belonged entirely to me. Derek would receive exactly what he'd brought to our marriage: his struggling architectural firm, the house with its overleveraged mortgage, and the debts he'd accumulated trying to maintain a lifestyle his declining income couldn't support. But the story gets even better because Derek's problems were just beginning. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, Derek made a decision that revealed just how desperately his situation had become. He applied for a position with a major architectural firm in Portland, hoping to escape Seattle's increasingly toxic professional environment and start fresh in a new city. The firm was impressed with his portfolio and invited him for a series of interviews. Everything seemed to be going well until they conducted their standard background check and reference verification. This is where Derek's careful narrative about my mental breakdown finally came back to haunt him. The hiring manager called Dr. Patricia Williams as a character reference, expecting to hear glowing praise for her successful architect son. Instead, she provided a clinical assessment of Derek's psychological patterns that raised immediate red flags about his fitness for a position requiring client interaction and team collaboration. Derek demonstrates classic narcissistic personality traits, she explained in her professional capacity as a psychology professor. He has difficulty accepting responsibility for his actions, tends to blame others for his failures, and shows a pattern of manipulating situations to maintain control over people he perceives as threatening to his self-image. The hiring manager was taken aback. "Dr. Williams, we were calling for a positive reference." "Are you saying you wouldn't recommend your own son for this position?" "I'm saying that any firm considering Derek should be aware of his character limitations and the potential risks they present in professional settings." His recent behavior toward his ex-wife, including abandoning her in a foreign country and then publicly claiming she was mentally unstable, demonstrates a level of cruelty and dishonesty that raises serious questions about his professional ethics. The job offer was quietly withdrawn. Word of Derek's failed background check spread through architectural circles, making it even more difficult for him to find new opportunities. The story of the architect whose own mother wouldn't provide a positive reference became a cautionary tale about the importance of character in professional settings. Other firms that had been considering Derek for positions began conducting more thorough background checks. They discovered the social media posts from Jake and Ryan celebrating my abandonment, the inconsistencies in Derek's story about my disappearance, and the growing recognition of my international success that contradicted his claims about my mental instability. Professional licensing boards began receiving complaints about Derek's conduct. While abandoning a spouse in a foreign country wasn't technically a violation of architectural ethics, the pattern of dishonesty and manipulation it revealed raised questions about his fitness for professional practice. But Derek's humiliation reached its peak 1 year after his visit to Corinthos at the annual Pacific Northwest Architecture Awards ceremony, an event where he'd once been a regular winner and where I'd played the supportive wife role for nearly a decade. Williams' Sustainable Design won 3 major awards that night: Sustainable Design Innovation, International Project Excellence, and the newly created Cultural Preservation Award for our work integrating traditional building methods with contemporary luxury standards. I accepted the awards via video link from our Athens office, with Sophia and Andreas standing proudly beside me as I thanked them for teaching me that authentic design comes from understanding and respecting the wisdom of local communities. Derek was in the audience that night, attending as a guest of a former colleague who'd taken pity on his professional isolation. The camera occasionally panned across the audience during my acceptance speeches, and you could see him sitting alone at a back table, his face a mask of barely controlled rage and humiliation. But the moment that made the evening truly perfect came during the Cultural Preservation Award presentation. The awards committee had commissioned a short documentary about the Corinthos project, featuring interviews with local community members about how the agritourism development had revitalized their village economy while preserving traditional farming methods. Sophia appeared on screen, speaking in Greek with English subtitles. Natalie came to us broken, abandoned by people who should have protected her. We taught her our ways, but she taught us something more valuable: that a woman's strength grows when she is loved and supported, not controlled and diminished. Andreas nodded beside her. Her husband threw her away like garbage. But garbage to one person can be treasure to another. She became our daughter, our partner, our friend. His loss became our greatest blessing. The camera then showed me working alongside them in the olive groves, my hands dirty from harvest work, my face glowing with genuine happiness as I explained how traditional agricultural techniques had informed our sustainable building practices. The contrast between the confident, accomplished woman on screen and the supposedly unstable wife Derek had been describing was impossible to ignore. When the documentary ended, the audience erupted in applause, but the camera caught Derek sitting in stunned silence, finally understanding that his attempts to destroy me had instead provided the foundation for achievements that would forever eclipse anything he could accomplish. The awards ceremony footage went viral in design communities worldwide. My acceptance speech, where I thanked Sophia and Andreas for showing me that real strength comes from building others up, not tearing them down, became a rallying cry for sustainable design advocates and women entrepreneurs. Design schools began using the Corinthos project as a case study in authentic cultural integration. Business schools featured my story in courses about entrepreneurship and resilience. The project became required reading in programs studying sustainable tourism development. The final twist came exactly 1 year after Derek's visit to Corinthos. I was in Seattle for a client meeting when I received an email with the subject line, "Business Proposal." Derek had apparently heard about my success through the design industry grapevine and thought we might be able to work together professionally. His firm was struggling, he admitted, and he wondered if Williams might consider a collaboration that could benefit both companies. The audacity was breathtaking. "I know things ended badly between us personally," he wrote, "but I think we could put that aside for the sake of business. Your international connections combined with my local experience could create opportunities for both of us. I'm willing to discuss terms that would be mutually beneficial." He'd included his portfolio and a detailed proposal for how our firms could partner on sustainable design projects in the Pacific Northwest. The proposal actually wasn't terrible from a business perspective, but it was built on the fundamental misunderstanding that I needed anything he could offer. The email revealed just how completely Derek had failed to understand what had happened. He still saw our relationship through the lens of his own importance, assuming that my success was somehow incomplete without his participation. He couldn't grasp that I'd built something entirely independent of him, something that didn't require his approval, partnership, or presence to thrive. I forwarded the email to my assistant with instructions to send Derek our standard rate sheet for consulting services: $1,000 per hour, minimum 10-hour commitment, payment in advance. I also included a note that all communications would be handled through our legal department due to the complicated personal history between the principals. Derek received an invoice for $10,000 and a formal cease and desist letter regarding any further unsolicited business contact. The invoice included a detailed breakdown of the consultation fee structure and a note explaining that Williams only worked with clients who met our standards for professional ethics and personal integrity. The humiliation of being invoiced by his ex-wife for a business proposal was apparently the final straw. Derek's response was a rambling, angry email that revealed just how completely his careful facade had crumbled. He accused me of being vindictive, of using my success to punish him for one mistake, of deliberately sabotaging his reputation out of spite. "You were nothing before you met me," he wrote. "I made you who you are, and now you're using what I taught you to destroy me. This isn't justice, it's revenge." The email was filled with the kind of threats and accusations that would have terrified me a year earlier, but now they just seemed pathetic. Derek still couldn't accept responsibility for his choices or acknowledge that my success had nothing to do with him. In his mind, I was still the dependent wife who existed only in relation to his achievements. I didn't respond directly to Derek's email, but I did forward it to Rebecca Martinez, my attorney, along with a note. "Please add this to our file documenting Derek's ongoing harassment and his inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own actions." Rebecca's response was swift and decisive. Derek received a formal cease and desist letter threatening legal action if he continued to contact me or Williams in any capacity. The letter included a detailed summary of his pattern of abusive behavior and made it clear that any further harassment would result in restraining orders and potential criminal charges. But you know what the sweetest revenge has been? It's not Derek's professional downfall or his repeated attempts at reconciliation. It's not even the satisfaction of watching his friends face the consequences of their cruelty. It's the life I built after he tried to destroy me. Every morning, I wake up in one of 4 homes I now own, sometimes in my cottage overlooking the Aegean Sea in Corinthos, sometimes in my eco-friendly townhouse in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood, sometimes in the sustainable retreat center I developed in Costa Rica for clients who want to experience regenerative design firsthand, and sometimes in the converted farmhouse in Tuscany, where we established our European training center for traditional building techniques. My calendar is full of meetings with clients who respect my expertise, video calls with team members around the world, and site visits to projects that are changing how people think about luxury, sustainability, and authentic cultural experiences. In the evenings, I work alongside Sophia and Andreas when I'm in Greece, tend to my rooftop gardens when I'm in Seattle, swim in bioluminescent waters when I'm in Costa Rica, or practice traditional stone carving techniques when I'm in Tuscany. The woman Derek abandoned in Italy thought she needed him to survive. The woman he found in Greece had learned she was capable of thriving. The woman I am today has built something he could never touch, never control, never diminish, an empire built on my own vision, supported by people who value my contributions, and protected by legal and financial structures he can't manipulate. Last month, I received another wedding invitation. This time, it was genuine good news. Melissa Ross, my college roommate, was marrying a wonderful man who supported her career and celebrated her successes. The reception was being held at a sustainable venue that had hired Chin Williams to design their event spaces. I attended this wedding with genuine joy, bringing Sophia and Andreas as my guests. Watching them marvel at the Space Needle and taste their first Seattle coffee while talking with my American friends about olive farming techniques was one of the most satisfying moments of my new life. During the reception, I noticed Derek standing alone near the bar, nursing a drink and watching my table with obvious discomfort. He looked older, smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of choices that had cost him everything he'd thought mattered. Melissa noticed my distraction and followed my gaze. God, Natalie, I can't believe you were married to that man for 10 years. He looks so bitter. He always was, I realized. I just made excuses for it because I thought that was what love looked like. And now? I looked around the table at my chosen family, Sophia and Andreas, who'd taught me about unconditional support, my business partners, who challenged and inspired me, my friends, who celebrated my successes without jealousy or competition. Now I know the difference between someone who loves you and someone who loves controlling you. Now I know the difference between building a life together and building a prison for someone else to live in. As the evening wound down, Derek approached our table with the careful steps of someone who'd been drinking just a little too much. Natalie, he said, his voice carrying a note of forced casualness. You look, well, successful. I am successful, I replied simply. I heard about the Costa Rica project. Very impressive. He paused, clearly struggling with whatever he'd come to say. I was wondering if you might have time to talk sometime. Maybe we could catch up, discuss things. Sophia, who'd been following the conversation despite the language barrier, said something in rapid Greek to Andreas. He nodded and stood up, positioning himself slightly behind Derek in a way that suggested the conversation was about to end. Derek, I said gently, we don't have anything to discuss. You made your choices, I made mine. We're both living with the consequences. But surely we could. No, I interrupted, my voice firm but not unkind. We couldn't. You see, the woman you abandoned in Italy died that day. The woman sitting here now was built from scratch by people who saw her value, encouraged her growth, and supported her dreams. She doesn't need your approval, your partnership, or your presence in her life. Derek stood there for a moment, seemingly searching for words that would bridge the chasm between who we'd been and who we'd become. Finally, he nodded stiffly and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of wedding guests who were too busy celebrating love to notice the ending of whatever we'd once had. Sophia reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Good," she said in English, one of her favorite words for moments when justice prevailed. "Now we dance." And we did dance, to music celebrating new beginnings, surrounded by people who'd chosen to love and support each other rather than control and diminish. We danced while Derek drove home alone to a small apartment, carrying the weight of choices that had cost him everything he'd never realized he was lucky to have. Today, 5 years after Derek abandoned me in that Italian town, John Williams' sustainable design is featured in international architecture magazines as one of the most innovative firms in the world. Our projects span 5 continents and have won awards for both design excellence and cultural sensitivity. The Demetrio family farm has become a model for sustainable agritourism that's studied by universities across Europe and replicated in communities around the world. I split my time between multiple countries, speak 6 languages, and wake up every day excited about the work ahead of me. My passport is full of stamps from business trips and cultural exchanges. My bank accounts reflect the value of work that honors both innovation and tradition. My calendar is full of meetings with people who respect my expertise and value my contributions. Derek still lives in Seattle, though he moved from our old house to a smaller apartment when he couldn't afford the mortgage payments after his business collapsed. His architectural career never recovered from the reputation damage, and he's been working as a project manager at someone else's firm for the past 3 years. He's been through several short-lived relationships since our divorce, but apparently he talks about his ex-wife enough that few women stay interested for long. I don't hate Derek anymore. Hatred requires too much energy, and I have better things to do with mine. But I am grateful to him, in a strange way. By trying to break me, he forced me to discover just how unbreakable I really was. By abandoning me, he freed me to find people who would never consider leaving someone they cared about stranded and vulnerable. By dismissing my capabilities, he motivated me to prove them in ways that exceeded even my own expectations. If you're watching this and thinking about someone in your life who's made you feel small, who's convinced you that you need them more than they need you, who's used your love as a weapon against your independence, I want you to remember something. Their opinion of your capabilities says nothing about your actual potential. Sometimes the cruelest thing someone can do to you becomes the greatest gift they could possibly give. Sometimes being abandoned forces you to discover you were never truly dependent in the first place. Sometimes the worst day of your old life becomes the first day of your new one. The woman Derek left crying on that Italian street corner would never have believed she could build what I've built, achieve what I've achieved, become who I've become. But she didn't need to believe it for it to be true. She just needed to survive long enough to find out. And if you're in that place right now, if someone has convinced you that you're not smart enough, strong enough, brave enough to make it on your own, please remember that their limitations are not your limitations. Their fears are not your reality. Their need to control you says everything about their insecurity and nothing about your capability. Before I sign off, I want to ask you something. What would you build if you knew no one could tear it down? What dreams would you pursue if you didn't need anyone's permission? What person would you become if you stopped making yourself small to make someone else comfortable? Because that's what this story is really about. Not revenge, but rebirth. Not getting even, but getting free. Not proving someone wrong, but proving yourself right about your own potential. Thank you for being part of this journey. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe in the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary lives after extraordinary betrayals, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps ensure more stories like this one reach people who need to know that their current situation is not their final destination. And please, in the comments below, tell me about your own moments of unexpected strength. When did someone's attempt to diminish you accidentally reveal your power? When did being underestimated become your secret advantage? Your stories matter, and sharing them helps create a community of people who understand that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest gifts. Until next time, remember, the person who tries to make you feel small has already revealed how intimidated they are by your potential. Don't shrink to make them comfortable. Grow despite their attempts to contain you. And when they finally realize what they've lost, you'll be too busy building your empire to care. The olive trees Sophia and Andreas taught me to tend will outlive us all, growing stronger with each passing season, their roots deep enough and their branches strong enough to weather any storm. Just like the woman who learned to tend them, they've discovered that the best response to someone trying to diminish you isn't getting smaller, it's growing beyond what anyone thought possible. Until you become so magnificent that their attempts to control you look like the desperate flailing of people who never understood your true worth. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming everything they said you could never be. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you discover that you were always capable of being that person. You just needed someone cruel enough to set you free.